The autumn air carried a crisp chill as Barron Trump walked across Princeton's historic campus, golden leaves crunching beneath his feet. At 19, he stood tall at 6'7", his lanky frame moving with purpose as he navigated the crowded pathways between century-old buildings. Unlike most freshmen who traveled in nervous packs, Barron walked alone, his backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes focused ahead. He'd spent years preparing for this moment, to be just another student, to blend in despite the impossible weight of his last name. His first few weeks had gone exactly as he hoped. Most students were too caught up in their own college beginnings to pay him much attention. A few whispers followed him, and occasionally someone would do a double take, but the bubble of privacy he'd carefully constructed remained mostly intact. Until today. Advanced Calculus with Professor Richard Taylor. Barron slipped into the lecture hall 5 minutes early, choosing a seat in the back row corner. He pulled out his notebook and 3 sharpened pencils, arranging them in a perfect line on the desk. Numbers had always made sense to him in a way people often didn't. In the world of mathematics, things either worked or they didn't. There were no alternative facts, no spin, no cameras waiting to catch his every awkward teenage moment. Students filed in, filling the hall with chatter. 2 guys in Princeton hoodies took seats nearby, glancing his way before leaning toward each other, whispering. Barron had grown used to this, the subtle recognition, the hushed comments. He focused on opening his textbook to the day's lesson. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., Professor Taylor strode into the room. He was shorter than Barron expected, with wire-rimmed glasses and a tweed jacket that had seen better days. His reputation preceded him, brilliant but demanding, with strong opinions he never hesitated to share. What the university website hadn't mentioned was his open disdain for Barron's father, something Barron would soon discover. "Welcome to the first day of Advanced Calculus," Professor Taylor announced, silencing the room. "I don't believe in wasting time, so we'll jump right in." He placed his battered leather briefcase on the desk and pulled out a stack of papers. "When I call your name, come get your syllabus." Barron tensed. The roll call. The moment his cover would be officially blown. The professor worked through the alphabet methodically. Thompson, Tiller, Tran. Then he paused, his finger hovering over the next name. His eyes narrowed as they lifted, scanning the room. Trump. Barron Trump. The room fell silent. Dozens of heads turned toward the back corner. Barron stood, his chair scraping against the floor in the quiet room. He walked down the aisle, feeling every eye track his movement. Professor Taylor held out the syllabus, a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes forming on his face. "Mr. Trump," he said, voice carrying across the silent room. "I wonder if you'll find out differential equations as challenging as some find basic climate science." A few nervous laughs rippled through the classroom. Barron took the paper, his face carefully blank, a skill learned from years in the public eye. "I look forward to finding out, sir," he replied quietly, then returned to his seat. As Professor Taylor continued the roll call, Barron studied the syllabus, circles of color rising on his cheeks. He'd hoped, perhaps naively, that college would be different. That he might be judged by his own merits rather than his family name. What he didn't know then, as he sat making careful notes while Professor Taylor launched into his first lecture, was that mathematics would become both his challenge and his salvation in the months ahead. He didn't know that the notebook under his careful penmanship contained the first chapter of a story that would surprise everyone, most of all, the professor who now looked at him with thinly veiled contempt. Barron had always loved numbers because they told the truth without bias. And soon, those numbers would tell his truth in a way nothing else could. 3 weeks into the semester, Barron had settled into a routine. Wake up at 6 a.m., run 4 miles around campus while most students were still asleep, shower, grab coffee at the small shop off Prospect Avenue, then head to classes. He'd become almost invisible, just how he liked it. Most students had gotten over the novelty of having a Trump in their midst, and Barron had found peace in anonymity. Until Advanced Calculus on Thursday morning. "Today, we're going to examine the practical applications of the Lagrangian function," Professor Taylor announced, pacing before the whiteboard covered in equations. His eyes swept across the lecture hall. "But first, let's review yesterday's concepts." Barron felt it coming before it happened. The professor had been working his way toward this moment for days now, calling on other students for simple problems while giving Barron pointed looks. "Mr. Trump," Professor Taylor said, his voice rising just enough to wake a dozing student in the front row. "Perhaps you could explain to the class how we would approach this integration problem." He gestured to a particularly nasty equation that wasn't from their assigned reading. Barron recognized it immediately, a modified version of a problem he tackled years ago while studying alone in the White House residence, long after his Secret Service detail thought he was asleep. The room went quiet. A few students shot him sympathetic glances. Others leaned forward curious. "That's a partial differential equation with variable coefficients," Barron said, his voice soft but steady. "It's not from our textbook." Professor Taylor's lips curled slightly. "I'm aware of that, Mr. Trump. I simply wonder if you're capable of extending beyond the assigned material. Or perhaps advanced mathematics isn't your family's strength. Numbers that add up correctly can be so inconvenient sometimes." A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the classroom. The political jab was thinly veiled. Barron felt heat rising in his face, not from embarrassment. He'd endured far worse in the public eye, but from a quiet anger. He'd spent years finding refuge in mathematics, staying up until dawn working through graduate-level problems, while his classmates at previous schools worried about prom dates and football games. "I'll try, sir," he said, standing slowly. He walked to the board, took the offered marker, and studied the equation. The room was completely silent now, 30 pairs of eyes fixed on his back. His hand hovered for a moment, then began to move. Barron worked methodically, his tall frame slightly hunched as he filled the board with steps, breaking the problem into manageable pieces, applying techniques that Professor Taylor hadn't yet taught the class. His handwriting was neat, precise, each symbol placed with careful consideration. 5 minutes passed. No one spoke. The only sound was the squeak of the marker against the whiteboard. When he finally turned around, Professor Taylor's smug expression had vanished, replaced by something Barron couldn't quite read. "That's correct," the professor said, his voice slightly different. "Though your approach is unorthodox." "It's based on Liu's method from the Beijing Institute," Barron explained quietly. "It's more efficient for this class of problem." Professor Taylor blinked. Liu's work isn't typically covered until second-year graduate courses. Barron just nodded and returned to his seat. As he sat down, he noticed a girl with glasses in the row ahead turning to give him a small, approving nod. The next day, Professor Taylor was waiting when Barron arrived early to class. "That was impressive work yesterday, Mr. Trump," he said, arms crossed. "Where did you study Liu's method?" "On my own," Barron replied. "Math makes sense to me." "Well, let's see if that was a fluke, shall we?" The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. "I'll be watching your work closely." Over the next week, the pattern continued. Professor Taylor would call on Barron, presenting him with increasingly difficult problems, clearly designed to trip him up. Each time, Barron would solve them, sometimes quickly, sometimes after careful thought, but always correctly. It was becoming a strange sort of duel, one that Barron hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. The class had noticed too. Some students now saved seats for him, offering encouraging smiles when he walked in. Others watched the growing tension with the excited interest of sports fans. What none of them knew was that late at night, Barron wasn't just keeping up, he was preparing. Each evening, he worked hours ahead, studying concepts the class wouldn't reach for weeks, determined that whatever challenge came next, he would be ready. The mathematics that had once been his private sanctuary was becoming a public battlefield. And despite himself, despite his desire to blend in and disappear, Barron was finding that there was something quietly satisfying about finally being seen for what he could do, rather than whose son he was. October brought a chill to the campus and a new level of tension to advanced calculus. Professor Taylor stood at the front of the classroom, tapping a stack of papers against the lectern. "Midterm projects," he announced, his voice cutting through the quiet murmurs. "This will count for 30% of your final grade." Barron sat up straighter, pencil poised over his notebook. He'd been expecting this. "You'll be working in pairs on a series of proofs related to our current unit," Professor Taylor continued, beginning to hand out assignment sheets. "I've taken the liberty of assigning partners." When he reached Barron's row, he placed a paper on his desk with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Trump, you'll be working alone on a special assignment." Barron glanced down at his paper. The other students had received a 3-page handout. His was 7 pages, filled with complex equations and theoretical problems that looked more suited to a doctoral thesis than an undergraduate course. "Is there a problem?" Professor Taylor asked, noticing Barron's slight frown. "No, sir," Barron replied quietly, though several students around him were now looking between their assignments and his with confused expressions. After class, a girl with dark-rimmed glasses and a messy ponytail approached him as he gathered his books. Barron recognized her as the student who had nodded to him after his first board challenge, the one who always asked the most insightful questions. "I'm Lily," she said, pointing to his assignment. "That doesn't seem fair." Barron shrugged. "Life isn't fair." "Spoken like someone who's had plenty of advantages," she replied, but her tone was more curious than accusatory. "And plenty of disadvantages you know nothing about," he countered, surprising himself with his openness. Lily studied him for a moment. "I've got a free hour. Want to grab coffee and look at that monster assignment? I'm pretty good with topology." Barron hesitated. He'd kept to himself since arriving on campus, avoiding close connections. It was easier that way. No awkward questions about his family, no secret photos sent to tabloids, no fake friendships based on curiosity about his famous last name. "Why would you help me?" he asked. "Because what he's doing isn't right," she said simply. "And because that Liu method solution you showed last week was brilliant. I'd never seen that approach before." An hour later, they sat in the corner of a small coffee shop off campus, papers spread across the table between them. Lily was indeed good with topology, better than good. As they worked through the problems, Barron found himself genuinely impressed by how quickly she grasped concepts. "How did you learn all this?" he asked after she explained a particularly elegant solution. "My grandfather was a math professor in Taiwan," she explained, pushing her glasses up. "He taught me calculus when I was 9, said girls should know numbers better than boys." She grinned. "What about you? You're not exactly what the tabloids make you out to be." Barron tensed, then slowly relaxed as he recognized genuine interest in her eyes, not the usual prying curiosity. "Numbers make sense when nothing else does," he said finally. "When I was 13, during a particularly bad news cycle about my family, I found a book on advanced mathematics in the White House library. It was peaceful. No opinions, no arguments, just pure logic. And now Professor Taylor is trying to use that against you," Lily observed. "He doesn't realize it's actually the one area where I'm comfortable being challenged." Barron replied with a small smile. They met every day that week, working through the assignment. Barron learned that Lily was on scholarship, that she played violin, that she wanted to work for NASA someday. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor, that he could recite pi to 100 decimal places, that he donated anonymously to math programs in underfunded schools. Neither mentioned politics. By Friday, they'd completed the entire assignment, all 7 pages of what was clearly graduate-level work. As they packed up their notes, Lily hesitated. "You know he's going to keep coming after you, right? This was just the beginning." Barron nodded. "I know." "So what will you do?" He thought for a moment. All his life, he tried to stay out of the spotlight, to avoid confrontation, to blend into the background while his family dominated headlines. "I guess I'll just keep solving the problems," he said finally. Lily grinned. "And I'll help. Someone needs to see the look on his face when you turn this in." As they walked back toward campus in the fading autumn light, Barron realized something had shifted. The challenge from Professor Taylor had begun as an attempt to humiliate him. Instead, it had led to the first real friendship he'd made at Princeton. Sometimes, he thought, problems led to unexpected solutions. The lecture hall buzzed with excitement as Professor Taylor strode to the podium. Barron slid into his usual seat, nodding at Lily, who sat nearby. 2 weeks had passed since they'd turned in the special assignment. The professor had said nothing about it, not even acknowledging its receipt. "Before we begin today's lecture," Professor Taylor announced, silencing the room, "I have an exciting announcement." He tapped his tablet, and the projector displayed a colorful poster for the Eastern Collegiate Mathematics Championship. "Princeton will host this year's competition next Friday," he continued. Each department will select one undergraduate to represent their class against top students from Harvard, Yale, MIT, and 12 other universities. Students whispered excitedly. The competition was prestigious. Winners often received internship offers from tech giants and research institutions. As the hosting university, we have the privilege of an automatic entry, Professor Taylor said, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Barron. And after careful consideration, I've selected our representative. Barron felt his stomach tighten. He knew what was coming. Barron Trump will represent our advanced calculus section. The room fell silent for a beat, then erupted in murmurs. Lily turned to give him a concerned look. They'd both understood what this was, not an honor, but a setup. The competition will include graduate students from other universities, Professor Taylor continued, eyes fixed on Barron. I trust you're up for the challenge, Mr. Trump. Or perhaps you prefer to decline. It was a trap. Accept and potentially face humiliation against students with years more experience, or decline and confirm the professor's apparent belief that he was nothing special, just a name. I accept, Barron said quietly, ignoring the knot in his stomach. After class, Lily caught up with him on the quad. 4 leaves swirled around their feet as they walked. He's trying to embarrass you, she said bluntly. Those grad students have been studying this stuff for years. I know, Barron replied, adjusting his backpack. Then why did you agree? He stopped walking, considering the question. Because running away never solves anything. I've spent my whole life trying to stay out of sight, trying not to draw attention. Maybe it's time to stop hiding. Lily studied his face. You're not what people think you are, you know that? Nobody is, he said with a small smile. They spent the next week preparing. Lily obtained sample problems from previous competitions, and they worked through them in the library until closing time each night. Barron was good, better than good, but some of the theoretical physics applications left him struggling. 3 days before the competition, after a particularly frustrating practice session, Barron sat alone in his dorm room, staring at problems he couldn't solve. For the first time, doubt crept in. What if the professor was right? What if he wasn't as special as he thought? What if he really was just coasting on his family name? His phone rang, startling him. His father's number. He almost didn't answer. Their relationship had been complicated, distant, yet bound by shared experiences few could understand. But after 4 rings, he picked up. Hello. Barron. His father's unmistakable voice filled the line. Your mother told me about this math competition. Big deal, apparently. It's nothing, Barron said automatically. Doesn't sound like nothing. Your mother says you're going up against graduate students. Barron sighed. Professor Taylor set it up. He's been challenging me. There was a pause, and Barron could almost see his father lean forward in his office chair, the way he did when something caught his interest. Because of me, his father stated flatly. It doesn't matter. Of course it matters. Another pause. You know, when I was building in Manhattan, everyone said I couldn't do it. Too young, they said, didn't have the experience. They all waited for me to fail. Barron had heard versions of this story before, but something in his father's tone was different tonight, less boastful, more reflective. What did you do? He asked. I stopped trying to make them like me, his father said simply. That was never going to happen. Instead, I showed them what I could do. Results speak louder than anything else, son. Barron thought about this. I'm not sure I can win. Winning isn't always the point, his father replied, surprising him. Sometimes you have to show them who you are, son, not who they think you are. After they hung up, Barron stared at the phone for a long moment. It was possibly the most genuine conversation they'd ever had. He picked up his notebook and turned to a fresh page. If he couldn't win with the standard approaches, maybe it was time to find his own way. The night before the competition, he called Lily. I think I've got it, he said without preamble. Meet me at the library in 20 minutes. I need to show you something. When she arrived, he spread his notes across the table, pages filled with elegant calculations that took a completely novel approach to the sample problems. This is, Lily stared, pushing her glasses up. This is brilliant, but it's not the standard method at all. That's the point, Barron said, a small smile forming. They're expecting me to fail at their game. so I'm changing the game. The day of the competition arrived with gray skies and a light drizzle that matched Barron's mood. He stood outside the mathematics building, watching students hurry past with umbrellas and raincoats, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake in accepting this challenge. "You look like you're heading to your own funeral," Lily said, appearing beside him with 2 coffee cups. She handed him one. "Drink this. It's got an extra shot." "Thanks," Barron murmured, taking a sip of the hot liquid. "I didn't sleep much." "Nerves." "I kept going over the methods we practiced. There are still gaps in my approach." Lily nudged his arm. "Stop overthinking. You've got this." Inside, the university's largest lecture hall had been transformed. A long table faced the audience, with nameplates marking positions for each competitor. Barron's eyes scanned the room, taking in the crowd, professors, students, even a few reporters. His gaze stopped when he spotted Professor Taylor speaking with the judges, gesturing animatedly. "Looks like your biggest fan is making sure everyone knows you're here," Lily whispered. A student volunteer approached them. "Mr. Trump, your seat is at position 4. Barron nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of his tall frame, unsure what to do with his hands. Lily gave his arm a quick squeeze. "Remember what we talked about? Think differently. These guys all learned from the same textbooks." He made his way to the table, taking his assigned seat. On his right sat a bearded graduate student from MIT wearing a wrinkled button-down. On his left, a serious-looking woman from Yale with a calculator watch. Both looked at least 5 years older than him. "Welcome to the Eastern Collegiate Mathematics Championship," announced the head judge, a white-haired woman from Columbia University. "Each competitor will receive the same 5 problems to solve within 2 hours. Points are awarded for correctness, elegance of solution, and innovation. Begin when the problems appear on your screens." Barron took a deep breath as the countdown began on the large display at the front of the room. His pulse raced in his ears. The timer hit 0, and the problems appeared on the tablet before him. His heart sank. The first problem was a complex integration that looked nothing like what he practiced. The second involved theoretical physics applications that made his head spin. The third was worse. Glancing sideways, he saw the MIT student already scribbling furiously. The Yale competitor was typing rapidly on her tablet. All around the table, the other students had jumped into the challenge with confidence. Barron stared at the screen, panic rising in his throat. He couldn't solve these, not the way they were expecting. Across the room, he caught Professor Taylor watching him, a barely concealed smile playing at the corners of his mouth. 15 minutes passed. Barron had written nothing. His mind raced through approaches, discarding each one as insufficient. The crowd began to murmur. He could feel the weight of their stares, their whispers. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe slowly. His father's words echoed. "Show them who you are, not who they think you are." Opening his eyes, he looked at the problems again. If he couldn't solve them the standard way, maybe there was another approach. He began to see connections between the problems, patterns that weren't immediately obvious but revealed themselves when he stepped back from conventional methods. He started writing, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. His approach wasn't tackling each problem separately, but rather finding a unified theory that addressed elements of all 5 simultaneously. It wasn't the expected approach, it was something entirely different. At the 1-hour mark, the MIT student beside him had completed 3 problems. The Yale competitor was on her 4th. Barron was still working on his unified approach, filling page after page with calculations. A judge walked behind him, pausing to look over his shoulder. Barron could sense the confusion as the man tried to follow his work. It didn't fit the expected solution format. By the 90-minute mark, sweat beaded on Barron's forehead. His approach was either brilliant or completely wrong. There would be no middle ground. He looked up briefly, catching Lily's eye in the audience. She gave him a small nod of encouragement. With 10 minutes remaining, most competitors had submitted their work. Barron was still writing, racing to complete his final calculations. The crowd's attention had shifted entirely to him, the only one still working, the youngest competitor, the one with the famous last name. 5 minutes remaining, announced the head judge. Barron's pencil flew across the paper. He was close, so close. The The connections between the problems had revealed a beautiful mathematical symmetry, but he needed to prove it worked for all cases. 1 minute remaining. With 30 seconds to spare, Barron set down his pencil and submitted his work. The room buzzed with speculation as the judges collected all materials and moved to a private room for evaluation. Lily appeared at his side as he stood on shaky legs. "How did it go?" "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I took a different approach. Either I just failed spectacularly or..." He didn't finish the sentence. "Or you just showed everyone exactly who Barron Trump really is," she completed, nudging his shoulder. "Come on, let's get some air while they decide." Outside, the rain had stopped and weak sunlight broke through the clouds. Barron leaned against the building's stone facade, suddenly exhausted. "No matter what happens," Lily said quietly, "you stay true to yourself in there. That counts for something." For the first time in weeks, perhaps in years, Barron felt a weight lifting. Whatever the outcome, he had faced the challenge head-on his own terms. He hadn't hidden or run away. He had finally stopped trying to be invisible. An hour passed like a small eternity. Barron sat on a bench outside the mathematics building, his leg bouncing with nervous energy while Lily paced in front of him. Students walked by, some offering curious glances at the tall young man whose name they recognized. "They're taking forever," Lily said, checking her watch for the 5th time. "That has to be a good sign, right? If your solutions were completely wrong, they would have finished judging quickly." Barron shrugged, trying to appear calmer than he felt. "Or they're trying to figure out how to disqualify me for not following the standard approach." Before Lily could respond, a student volunteer hurried toward them. "They're announcing the results now," she said breathlessly. "Everyone's looking for you." The lecture hall was packed when they returned, even more crowded than before. News of Barron's unusual approach had apparently spread across campus. He squeezed through the crowd, aware of the whispers that followed him. The judges had returned to their seats at the front, their faces frustratingly unreadable. Professor Taylor stood slightly apart, arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Thank you all for your patience," the head judge began, adjusting her glasses. "This year's competition presented extraordinary challenges, and we've seen some remarkable work today." Barron's mouth went dry as she continued. "Before announcing our rankings, we feel compelled to address something unprecedented in this competition's 30-year history." She paused, looking directly at Barron. "One competitor took an approach that initially confused our judging panel. Instead of solving the 5 problems separately using standard methods, this student developed a unified theoretical framework that addressed all 5 problems simultaneously." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The MIT student beside Barron shot him a surprised look. "After careful review and consultation with 3 department chairs, we determined that this approach not only solved the assigned problems correctly, but revealed connections between them that..." She paused again. "That, frankly, none of us had previously recognized." Professor Taylor's expression shifted from confidence to confusion. "The elegance of this solution demonstrates a level of mathematical intuition rarely seen at any academic level," the judge continued. "Therefore, before announcing the overall rankings, we are presenting a special recognition for innovative thinking." She lifted a certificate. "Barron Trump of Princeton University, please come forward." The room erupted. Some people clapped enthusiastically, others looked stunned. Barron felt frozen to his spot until Lily nudged him forward. As he approached the judge's table on legs that felt disconnected from his body, he caught Professor Taylor's eye. The man's face had drained of color. "Mr. Trump," the head judge said, handing him the certificate, "your approach to these problems was nothing short of revolutionary. May I ask where you developed this method?" The microphone captured his quiet response. "I couldn't solve the problems the way everyone else was trying to, so I looked for connections instead of separations." She nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the greatest mathematics comes from necessity." "Congratulations." When the overall rankings were announced minutes later, Barron had placed 3rd behind 2 PhD candidates with years more experience, a result that felt like victory given the circumstances. As the crowd began to disperse, Barron found himself surrounded by students and professors from various universities, all asking questions about his approach. For once, no one seemed interested in his last name. Across the room, he spotted Professor Taylor slipping out a side door. Later that evening, after escaping the impromptu celebration Lily had organized with classmates, Barron walked alone across the quiet campus. The setting sun cast long shadows between buildings as he tried to process everything that had happened. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed Professor Williams, the mathematics department chair, calling his name from the steps of the administrative building. "Mr. Trump, I'm glad I caught you," the older man said, gesturing for Barron to join him. "I've been hoping to speak with you." "Is something wrong with my competition entry?" Barron asked, immediately concerned. Professor Williams chuckled. "Quite the opposite. I spent the last 2 hours on a video call with colleagues at MIT and Stanford discussing your approach. It's quite remarkable." Barron shifted uncomfortably under the praise. "But that's not why I wanted to speak with you," the department chair continued. "After the competition, I became curious about your background. I hope you don't mind, but I did some research." Barron tensed. Here it came, another conversation about his father, his family, politics. "I found something interesting," Professor Williams said, pulling out his tablet. 3 papers published in the Journal of Mathematical Theory over the past 2 years, authored by B.T. Frederick. Barron's breath caught. He'd used his middle name and his mother's maiden name as a pseudonym, hoping to publish his work without attention. "That's you, isn't it?" Professor Williams asked gently. After a moment, Barron nodded. "How did you know?" "The approach in those papers bears a striking resemblance to what we saw today, particularly your work on topological data analysis." The professor smiled. "Why the pseudonym?" Barron looked out across the campus, gathering his thoughts. "I wanted the work to be judged on its own merit," he finally said, "not associated with everything else." Professor Williams nodded slowly. "I understand. But you should know, your work was already being noticed. The pseudonym wasn't hiding your brilliance, only your identity." As darkness settled over the campus, they talked about mathematics, about Barron's unusual approaches, about ideas he'd been developing since he was 15. For the first time since arriving at Princeton, he felt truly seen for his mind rather than his name. What neither of them noticed was Professor Taylor, standing in the shadows of a nearby building, watching their conversation with a complex expression on his face. The weeks following the competition brought changes Barron hadn't expected. Students who had previously avoided him now approached with questions about class assignments. Professors nodded respectfully when he passed them on campus. His competition certificate hung on his dorm room wall, not out of pride, but as a reminder that he had finally stopped hiding. The only constant was Professor Taylor's class, where the atmosphere remained tense and uncomfortable. The professor had stopped calling on Barron entirely, neither acknowledging his competition performance nor continuing his previous pattern of challenging questions. They existed in a strange limbo, carefully avoiding direct interaction. Until the email arrived. "Professor Taylor wants to see me in his office tomorrow morning," Barron told Lily as they studied in the library. No explanation why. Lily looked up from her textbook, pushing her glasses back. "Maybe he's finally going to apologize." "I doubt that," Barron said, but curiosity nagged at him all night. The next morning, he stood outside Professor Taylor's office door, hand raised to knock, when he heard voices inside. Completely inappropriate treatment of a student, came Professor Williams' stern voice. "The university has standards, Richard." "I was challenging him," Professor Taylor replied defensively. "That's my job." "There's a difference between academic challenge and personal targeting. You assigned him graduate-level work while giving standard assignments to everyone else. You put him in a competition against PhD candidates." Barron lowered his hand, uncomfortable with overhearing this conversation. "I thought he was coasting on his name," Professor Taylor said, his voice softer now. "I assumed." "You assumed based on politics," Professor Williams cut in. "And in doing so, you nearly missed recognizing an extraordinary mathematical mind. Stanford has already expressed interest in his work. MIT as well." The voices moved closer to the door, and Barron quickly stepped away, pretending to study the department bulletin board when the door opened and Professor Williams emerged. "Ah, Mr. Trump," the department chair said with a nod. "Right on time. Professor Taylor is expecting you." The office was smaller than Barron had imagined, book-lined walls making it feel even more cramped. Professor Taylor sat behind a desk cluttered with papers and coffee mugs, looking somehow diminished. "Mr. Trump," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Thank you for coming." Barron sat, uncertain what to expect. The professor tapped his fingers against the desk, seemingly struggling with words. "I've been reviewing your work from the semester," he finally said, "including your special assignment and competition entry." Barron waited. "Your approach to the Lagrangian problem set was unorthodox but effective, and your unified theory framework at the competition was genuinely innovative." This wasn't at all what Barron had expected. He shifted in his chair, unsure how to respond. Professor Taylor sighed, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. "I'm not particularly good at this, so I'll be direct. I made assumptions about you that were unfair and unprofessional. My treatment of you this semester has been inappropriate." The admission hung in the air between them. "I understand," Barron said quietly. "No, I don't think you do," the professor countered, leaning forward. "I spent 20 years teaching mathematics, priding myself on recognizing talent wherever I find it. Yet I allowed personal politics to blind me to what was right in front of me." He gestured to a stack of papers on his desk. Barron recognized his competition entry and previous assignments. "This work deserves recognition and development," Professor Taylor continued. "Which brings me to the reason I asked you here today. I'm leading a research project next semester on applications of topological data analysis in climate prediction models. Your approach could be valuable. I'd like you to consider joining the team." Barron stared at him, processing the unexpected offer. "You don't need to decide immediately," the professor added. "And I would understand if you preferred not to work with me, given our history." The easy response would be rejection. After all, this man had spent months trying to humiliate him. But something in the professor's genuine acknowledgement of his mistake made Barron pause. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Professor Taylor nodded. "That's fair." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, your mathematical intuition is exceptional. Perhaps even more impressive than your father's business intuition. Different fields, but similar gifts for seeing patterns others miss." It was, Barron realized, the first time someone had compared him to his father in a way that felt like a genuine compliment rather than an assumption or accusation. As he left the office and stepped into the bright December sunshine, Lily was waiting on a nearby bench. "Well," she asked, falling into step beside him. "How bad was it?" "Strangely not bad at all," Barron replied, still processing the meeting. "He apologized and offered me a research position. Are you going to take it?" Barron considered the question as they walked across the frost-covered quad. The semester had begun with him trying to be invisible, to avoid judgment based on his name. Now he faced a different kind of challenge, working with someone who had misjudged him but was willing to reconsider. "I think I might," he said slowly. "People are more complicated than the labels we put on them. Maybe that's true for both of us." Lily smiled. "That's possibly the wisest thing I've heard all semester, math genius." As they headed toward the dining hall, Barron felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. He had come to Princeton hoping to hide who he was. Instead, he had finally begun to discover it.